Humiliation doesn't always come in silence. Sometimes it roars in laughter so loud it drowns out your heartbeat. That night, under the glaring lights of the community hall, my cousin didn't just embarrass me, she tried to erase me. The memory still feels like a brand against. The hall was dressed in decorations meant for celebration, balloon streamers and a banner congratulating our aunt and uncle on. Yet for me, it became the stage of my public crucifixion. The air was warm with chatter and the clinking of glasses, but when my cousin tapped her spoon against a glass, the room went silent. I thought she was about to toast the couple, maybe share something, but when she spoke my name, the light felt harsh, illuminating me, though I didn't even know the chart. She began with sweet, a tone laced with false nostalgia, reminding everyone how close we'd been. Her words painted shared secret, each sentence carried. Then, like the flip of a switch, her voice hardened, but family deserved. Her eyes locked on me as if daring me. In that moment, I understood telling a story. She was building a stage for me. Shame struck first. My face burned as her accusations droned that mimic. She called me selfish, accused me of betrayal, and suggested I had been lying to the very people. She dressed her lies in the clothing of half-truth, weaving together moments from my past and distorting them until they resembled. Gasps rippled through the audience, and then came the first laugh, sharp and cruel, echoing like a gunshot. Each whisper that followed felt like a nail hammering into my chest. Shame doesn't just redden your cheeks, it makes you want to crawl out of your own skin. And I stood there, frozen, while the crowd devoured her words. Then came injustice. She knew exactly what she was doing, twisting stories, choosing details that made me look guilty, and framing her cruelty as honesty. The worst part wasn't just the lies. This was my cousin, my confidant, the girl I had once considered my sister. She of all people knew my struggles, my vulnerability, and here she was, weaponizing them against me. Injustice tastes bitter, and it settled on my the silence of my family, not the kind that explodes. Steady and dangerous. I wanted to scream, to tear down her lies word by word, but I knew the trap she had set. If I lashed out, I'd look defensive, guilty even. If I cried, I'd look weak. She had cornered me with a strategy she'd been perfecting for years, using my silence against me. So I clenched my fist behind my back and let the anger smolder, its fire fueling something else, resolve. Still, there was helplessness. Standing there with the weight of every gaze pressing into me, I felt like a prisoner shackled by perception. My own voice, the truth itself, seemed powerless against her performance. Americans love a scandal, and in that room, my cousin was giving them exactly what they want: drama, betrayal, and the thrill of choosing. I saw heads nodding, eyes narrowing, and I realized I was being tried, only entertained. My silence was my, and then threatened to drown me. Not about her. She thought she was buried. Out was the envelope, the email waiting. Her speech was dramatic, yes. She was gambling everything on the assumption that no one could, that her narrative was. But I knew something she didn't. Sometimes blood ties aren't what they seem. Sometimes DNA tells a story that no lie can overwrite. Then came her so-called finale, the shocking blow she believed would. She hinted at a secret, implying I had been someone close to me. The crowd gasped as though her words carried divine authority. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for 1 second, but then the shock shifted. Her desperation. She wasn't just she was deflecting. She wasn't exposing truth. She was running from it, and that realization steadied me and nothing else could. Vindication didn't roar. It whispered. It reminded me of the sterile cotton swab, the precise instruction, and the clinical clarity. While she was busy spinning webs, I had been collecting threads of truth, weaving them into a net she would. The power of that knowledge hummed beneath me, quiet but undeniable. Let her laugh now. Soon those same lips would tremble when confronted with. I even imagined the moment of the way her face would pale, the way her laughter would die in her throat, the way the family who applauded her performance tonight would recoil from her tomorrow. She thought this was my downfall, but it was only the opening scene, and that's when triumph began to take. Not the shallow triumph of scoring points in a public argument, but the deeper triumph of knowing time was on my side. Truth doesn't need applause, it just needs patience. I stood there, outwardly calm, inwardly resolved, and let her finish her grand performance. My cousin believed she had won, but she had only set the stage for her. She didn't know that while she was basking in the glow of her false victory, I was holding on to something far more powerful. DNA doesn't lie, and soon, the very science she mocked. Her laughter echoed, but it wouldn't last. The next time she faced, people always said we were envy turned my cousin. After the chaos of that, my mind couldn't. You don't get humiliated without wondering how The truth is, it had been a slow poison drop of bitterness until the bond was something darker. When we were children, we were closer than sisters. Mothers dressed us up and we clung to each other at the rest of the world. I can still picture us, and we swore that no people used to smile at us. Look at them, they're inseparable. I believed it with the kind of blind devotion, but time has a way of revealing that laughter can hide. Somewhere between middle school and high school, I noticed little changes in her. At first, if I wore a new shirt, if I joined a club, when I got a compliment from a teacher, she suddenly became the teacher. I brushed it off, telling myself it was normal cousin rival, the kind of competitive spirit, but slowly the copying turned into and the competing turned into she started making little comments, subtle at first. If someone praised my grades, well, she had to study all night just to get that. If I was complimented on my outfit, she'd laugh and add, she borrowed it from me because she didn't have anything nice to wear. They were small digs, wrapped in humor, so nobody else noticed the bite beneath the laugh. But I noticed. Each jab left a mark, though I told myself not to take it personally. After all, she was my cousin, my best friend. Family doesn't mean perfection, I reminded myself. It means forgiveness. But forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. And that's what I unknowingly gave her, permission to keep going. Her jealousy grew bolder. She would flirt with boys she knew I liked, then shrug it off as coincidence when I confronted her. She'd accidentally tell others my secret, spinning them in ways that embarrassed me, then claim she didn't realize it was a big deal. I remember one summer when I went to save up for a new, the day I finally got it, glowing with pride, she announced to everyone at a barbecue that I could never earn that much. It was a lie, but in the moment I was calling her out, shame became a familiar. Every time she belittled, even when I had, her behavior wasn't just, it was calculated to make sure she always stood taller, and yet I realized it was crushing me. Injustice brewed beneath. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. While she chipped away at she'd smile sweetly at me in private. I wanted to believe, but the evidence piled undeniable. Too often, of course, tried to bury it. If I told friends, playing innocent at twisting situations, so I looked oversensitive. I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe I was the problem, if maybe I was imagining the venom in her words. Gaslighting works like that. It makes you doubt your own reality until you feel trapped in someone else's version of the. But even in the depths of helplessness, suspense lingered, because deep down, I knew the story wasn't. Something in my gut whispered that my cousin's obsession with me wasn't just it was about something bigger, something she was hiding beneath. I began noticing the way her smile faltered when family the way she bristled at certain topics, her competitiveness. She wasn't just and people don't go to such. The first real, it wasn't a small I had confided, believing that despite everything, twisting it, the words hit me like replaced by. Shock gave way to the first flicker, because while I felt she wasn't making choices that for years I had it as immature, but in that moment, the shame she tried to force actually hers. Her actions screamed of desperation, of someone trying to cover up their own cracks, and I realized something. I imagined what her shame would, and that thought, I didn't know it then, but beginning. That single act would unravel everything, leading me straight to the secret she had worked her entire life to. I used to think betrayal came from strangers, until the day my cousin's smile betrayed me. Looking back now, it almost feels naive how blind I was to the cracks that had been forming for years. The childhood closeness, the teenage rivalry, the whispered betrayals I brushed, they had all been warning signs. But there's always a moment, a single day, when the truth refuses to be. For me, that day came not with a knife in my back, but with whispers in the hallways and eyes that refused. It wasn't just a single betrayal. It was the kind of wound that reshapes your entire sense of. And it all began with a rumor planted so carefully, so deliberately, that it spread like wildfire before I even knew what. It happened when I was in high school, though the damage carried well beyond those years. At the time, I had worked hard to build a reputation as someone trustworthy, reliable, and I wasn't perfect, but people respected me. Teachers counted on me, friends leaned on me, and even when life wasn't easy, I held my head high. That's why the rumor hit like a sucker punch. It was crafted to attack the very foundation of. My cousin whispered that my success wasn't earned, that everything people me was built on. First, I didn't believe anyone would, but words have a way, especially when the first sign was subtle. A friend who used to wave enthusiastically suddenly offered only a stiff nod. Another friend avoided sitting next to me at lunch. Teachers who once smiled warmly now regarded me with a trace of suspicion, their compliments replaced with curt acknowledgments. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each small change in behavior slicing away at the trust I had once taken for granted. By the end of that week, I felt like I was walking through a minefield where every glance could be an accusation. Shame settled over me like a heavy coat I couldn't shrug off. Even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, I couldn't stop the flush whenever I overheard or caught a whisper cut short when I. That's the cruelty of lies. They force you to carry the weight of guilt you don't deserve. I found myself apologizing in where no apology, speaking softer, shrinking smaller, hoping to earn back trust that had never rightfully been. My cousin's rumor had done what years of hard work couldn't undo. It made people question me, and that's where the injustice hit hardest. I wasn't just being gossiped, my cousin had chosen. Her lie was surgical precision, targeting the thing that mattered most to me, my integrity. She knew how much I valued being dependable, being someone others could count on. And she decided to poison that image, not because she had proof, but because she wanted to see me fall. The unfairness of it gnawed at me. I wanted to scream, to demand that people remember who I really was, to force them to see the truth. But injustice is cruel. It strips away your voice even as it amplifies. Anger swelled inside me, raw and I couldn't believe she had gone that far. Competing with me over clothes or attention was one thing, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't jealousy anymore, it was sabotage. She wanted to ruin standing in the bathroom, gripping the but anger without, and so came help. I couldn't confront her without sounding paranoid, and I couldn't stop the room. The more I tried to defend myself, that's the trap. Once they're spoken, a life of their own, and every move you make is. I felt like I was every attempt to fight, but inside, yet in that darkness, deep down, small detail that suggested the. I remembered overhearing her voice too low, bragging about. Remembered the way she, and most of all, not the warm smile from her, but a new one, sharp, knowing. It was a smile that betrayed, the kind of smile you can't. The shock hit me fully the day I had just been left out of a group who had once begged to part. Their excuses were flimsy, but I swallowed them with a nod, pretending not to care. As I walked away, I glanced, and there she was, leaning against a log. Our eyes met, and she didn't flinch. Instead, her lips curved into a cruel twist of satisfaction. She wanted me to know she was the architect. That single moment, the denial I had clung to shattered. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't insecurity. This was intentional. She had chosen to hurt me, and she was proud of it. That moment, as painful as it was, also planted the seed of vindication. Because when someone shows you who they really are, you can no longer be deceived. My cousin had revealed herself, not through words, but through that smirk, that gleam of triumph in her eyes. She wasn't innocent. She wasn't misunderstood. She was guilty, and I knew it. She had exposed her true nature, and as much as it hurt, there was relief in that clarity. I no longer had to question whether I was imagining things. I no longer had to wonder if I was being unfair. The truth was right there, staring at me with smug delight. And in that truth, I found a strange sort of strength. I began to imagine the day her games would backfire, the moment her smirk would falter, the instant her lie. I pictured her face turning, her eyes widening and her confidence evaporating. She thought she was untouchable, but people like her always. Lies are heavy, and eventually that vision of her shame. For the first time, I stopped feeling like the victim of her and started seeing myself as a witness. It hadn't happened yet, but it would. I didn't know when or how, and everyone else would see. And when that day came, the triumph would be in survival. As I turned away from her smirk, she would not get away. I didn't know yet what revenge would take, but I knew the game. From that day forward, when lies are told often enough, they start to feel like truth, unless someone fights back. After that day in the hallway, when I caught her smirking at the chaos she'd created, my world began to feel like a house built on shifting sand. Nothing was steady anymore. Every friendship, every glance across that her words had already reached. Rumors don't walk, and with my cousin orchestrating them, they didn't just spread. She had mastered the art of manipulation, and I was quickly realizing that her skill wasn't but in twisting half-truths so cleverly that she would take a single mistake, something small. If I missed a homework assignment, she claimed I was always. If I forgot to return a call, she told people I was selfish, and if I disagreed with her in private, she'd spin it as me. She never invented her. She anchored them in just enough reality. That's what made them. It's easy to deny a complete. What made it worse was she had perfected just concerned. I just worry about her. She positioned herself as a looked out for me, even as she sharp. They didn't see the malice behind. They only saw the performance. The concerned family member reluctant. The more she twisted, the more sympathy she became the victim in her. She would tell people how hard it was, how she tried to help. Suddenly she was the selfless cousin, and I was painted as. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I found myself drowning in the current. My anxiety grew unbearable. I started second-guessing every move I made, terrified that anything could, a missed call, even a tired lie awake at night, replaying analyzing. Arsenal. It wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. She had already shown me that no secret was safe, no moment too small to twist. My cousin had turned my life into her stage, and every choice I made became part of her script. The stress began to break me down. I lost weight without trying, my grades slipped, and the girl who once walked with confidence now walked with her head lowered, scanning faces for judgment. Shame settled on me daily, the shame of being misunderstood, of having my character assassinated by someone I. Shame is heavier than guilt because guilt belongs to you, but shame is forced onto you by others. I carried that weight everywhere, my own skin feeling like a costume. And then came the raw injustice. I hadn't done the things, I hadn't betrayed, hadn't become the person she. But in the court of public opinion, evidence doesn't matter. Only the story. And her story was spreading like. Every time I tried to correct the record, it sounded like. Every time I defended myself, it sounded like. She had crafted the perfect trap, and I was caught. Anger surged inside me, hotter than ever. I wanted to scream the truth in her face, but anger without strategy is. And I knew if she would raise her hands. See what I've been dealing with? No, I couldn't give her that. My anger had to be harnessed, channeled into something smarter, something stronger. But there were days when helplessness, days when I wondered if maybe this was my fate, to be misunderstood, to be cast as the villain in her carefully written. I felt trapped, silenced by a narrative I was forced to stop. It was suffocating. There were moments when I considered giving up, withdrawing completely, letting her win just so the torment. But every time I reached that don't let her rewrite. That whisper kept me up, and eventually, suspense began. Not the suspense, but the suspense. I realized that my power. I needed to gather proof, build a record. That I started writing everything down, specific words she who were present. Kept a journal, not of my feelings, but of her lies. Each page a safeguard, a way of clawing. And then came one evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across a post. It was a thinly veiled reference, repeating the exact words my cousin had once whispered in private. That was when I knew for certain that she wasn't just carelessly talking. She was deliberately planning stories, letting them spread like weeds in a garden I could no longer recognize. She wanted everyone to see me through her lens, to believe her narrative so complete that even I couldn't break it. But as painful as the shock was, it also brought vindication, because now I had proof, not just in my journal, but out in the open. Her lies weren't whispers anymore. They were public. And that meant I wasn't crazy. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. And I had the evidence. For the first time, I felt the faintest flicker of. I began to imagine the day when my notes would finally. I pictured her standing in front of and in that quiet, she wasn't invincible. She had built her and all it would take. I didn't know when that night, my cousin, emboldened by her growing audience, stood up and made an accusation so shocking. I thought I had seen the worst of but nothing prepared me for. It was one thing to whisper lies, to poison friendships and twist truths. But that evening, surrounded by friends, family, and she decided it wasn't enough to hurt me, and she wanted to break me in front of everyone, to make my downfall. That was the moment and became a dagger thrust. It happened at a family gathering, one of those big American parties, because absence the hall was buzzing, and the smell of catered food never quite tasted. Children darted between tables, adults swapped gossip, and music played. On the surface, because I knew for the first hour, I made small talk, helped my aunt, and tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, this night would pass without incident. But when my cousin stood up, spoon in hand, tapping against her glass for attention, my stomach dropped. The room quieted instantly, as it always does when someone signals a speech is coming. I prayed she was going to toast our aunt and uncle, to keep the focus where it belonged. But when she said my name, drawing every pair of eyes toward me, I knew I was about to be stripped bare. She started gently, as she always did, weaving a web with threads of false sincerity. She spoke about our childhood, about how close we had been, about how she had always admired me. Her tone was sweet, almost tender, but her eyes betrayed her, sharp, calculating, watching me squirm under the attention. And then, just as before, her words shifted. She claimed she couldn't stay silent any longer, that the family deserved honesty, that she was tired of protecting me to deceive everyone. Her voice quivered just enough to sound, and gasps rose from the crowd as she prepared to deliver her so-called truth. Shame was the first wave that hit me. She accused me of betraying someone close, of living a lie, of manipulating people. She didn't need to provide detail. The implication alone was enough to set tongues. I felt the heat, my pulse pounding so loudly in my curiosity. Their expressions burned. Shame isn't just it's being seen as guilty before. But then the injustice, standing trial, she knew exactly what choosing her stage, timing her words it wasn't about truth, it was about spectacle. She wasn't exposing me, she was performing, and the injustice of it nails dug into every fiber. But anger is dangerous. I knew if she wanted me to, so I clenched swallowed my fury, and yet, despite my anger, helplessness, stop her. Every word she spoke sank into the room like poison, infecting people's minds. I saw the whispers begin, the sideways glances, the way people leaned closer to one another as if sharing a secret they had always suspected. Lies, when spoken with confidence, become more convincing than truth spoken with and I hesitated, because how could I defend myself without sounding defensive? How could I prove a negative, that I hadn't done the thing she claimed? In that moment, but beneath the helplessness, suspense started. I thought about the careful notes. She was bold tonight, but boldness often, as much as I hated every second of her performance, a part of me began, how much longer could she? Then came the moment, her words, already outrageous, suggesting that it's so devastating. The gasp, but then I caught that same cruel smirk, the one that betrayed, and in that instant, shock turned, vindication but steady. She wasn't exposing me, she was exposing her. Every word every dramatic, I could see it now, even if the other, her hunger for her performance too. She wasn't a concerned, she was an actress desperate for a, and her lies were, for the first time that night, felt something other than, she was digging her own grave, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger to help. I imagined just for a moment what her shame would look, the way her confidence, the way her out. That thought gave me a glimpse of triumph. It wouldn't be me. Let her bask in the. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because while she believed she had broken me, I was already planning the day I would rise again. When the applause faded and the whispers began, I didn't argue, I didn't plead, and I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked away from the hall with my head high, and made myself a promise. She would not get away with this. Not this time. My silence tonight was not surrender. It was the calm before the storm. Sometimes the only way to fight back isn't louder, it's smarter. Walking out of that hall, my cousin's laughter and the murmurs of my family trailing behind me, I felt like I had been stripped of everything that once defined me. I had endured her betrayal in silence, not because I lacked words, but because I knew my words would have been twisted into weapons against me. Still, the silence was heavy. It pressed down on me as I stepped into the night air, cool against my burning. I kept my head high, but inside, shame gnawed at me like replaying the scene again and again, whispering that I had let her win. For days afterward, I couldn't shake that humiliation. Every time I closed my eyes, heard the crowd's gasps, felt the sting of whispers. At first, I avoided family gatherings. I stopped answering calls. It was easier to hide, but hiding only the injustice of it all. The knowledge that she had weaponized, twisted it into and plunged it into me. And for what? For envy? For control? For satisfaction? Anger started simmering, hotter with each memory of her false concern and fake tears. I wanted to scream, to storm into her house and expose her cruelty. I wanted to shatter the mask she wore so confident, but every time anger threatened to spill over, I remembered the lesson I had already learned. Rage would only make me look. My fury was real, but it couldn't be my weapon. If I was going to fight, I needed something stronger than it. The helplessness near each day that passed, I felt further from the lies poisoned every. My self-worth eroded, not because I believed, but because everyone else seemed to. I couldn't convince my family, or even myself, that I deserved better. I was trapped in her narrative, forced to live as the villain in that feeling of being. But even in that helplessness, something small began that I couldn't let this. Found strength first in solitude. The silence that had once suffocated me began to give me room to think. I started journaling again, not just recording her lies, but also reminding myself of who I was. I wrote down my achievements, my values, my memories of kindness, anything that could tether me to the truth of myself when her lies threatened to rewrite it. Slowly, that act of writing rebuilt something inside me. I wasn't worthless. I wasn't the liar she painted me to be. I was still me. But solitude alone wasn't enough. I needed an anchor outside myself, someone who could remind me I wasn't crazy, someone whose voice could drown out hers. That's when I turned to a friend I trusted more than anyone else, Melissa. She had been my rock before, and though I had pulled away from everyone in my shame, she refused to let me disappear completely. One evening, sitting across from her at a quiet cafe, I finally poured out the rumors, the public humiliation, the smirk that told me my cousin enjoyed every second of my. Melissa listened, her eyes never leaving, and when I finally stopped speaking, you can't fight her the way she uses lies. You need to use not just words. That's the only thing her words struck me hard. Proof. That was what I needed. Her encouragement gave courage I hadn't felt. I began thinking straight. I gathered my journals. I started paying closer attention, and I began noticing every lie, every manipulation. And the more I looked, she wasn't just she was hiding something. The first hint came during a casual family, one of those moments where everyone was reminiscing about. Someone mentioned a family, and I noticed her smile faltered. It wasn't the kind of reaction it was the kind of reaction. I filed it away. Just another note, and then it happened again. Another family quickly changed the subject. Laughed just a little too. That's when suspicion began. Why would she deflect so quickly, unless there was something she. Suspense took over my thought. It wasn't enough to survive her lies anymore. I needed to understand. My cousin's cruelty had always seemed obsessive, as if it wasn't just about envy, but about desperation. What if her attacks on. What if they were about herself? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. People don't burn others unless they're trying to cover up their own smoke. Then came the shock, the moment everything clicked. One evening, I was sorting through old family photos when I noticed something peculiar. Pictures of us as kids lined the album, but in some of them, there was a disconnect. Family resemblances that should have been there weren't. She looked different in subtle but undeniable ways. I remembered offhand whispers of. Suddenly, all of it began. My cousin wasn't just lying about. She was lying about herself. That realization sent a shiver through me. For years I had carried her betrayal as though it were but what if the truth was that her cruelty came from her own hidden shame? What if every rumor, every public every twisted it wasn't just jealousy, it was camouflage. And if I could uncover that secret, I could unravel every. Vindication surged in me. For the first time, I didn't just I felt like her lies no longer seemed desperate, frantic, the actions of, and suddenly her secret was hid. Gossip could be, I realized, was locked in something as small. That night, one thought pulsed loud, the only way DNA would be the one thing and I knew then that her downfall was. Her tongue slipped once, and that mistake set me on a path she never saw coming. In the weeks after I chose strategy over spectacle, my world became a quiet investigation. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront her. I didn't try to repair the opinions of people who had enjoyed the theater of my humiliation. Instead, I listened. I watched. I let the noise of her narrative fade into the background until it was nothing more than static, and in that careful silence, the pattern I'd been missing began to form. When you've been gaslit for long enough, you learn to stop arguing with the fire and start mapping the. I spent my evenings with old photo albums and my mornings with a notebook, writing dates, names, and somewhere inside the rubble of our. And I intended to. Her slip happened on a Sunday. Smells like dishwasher. When my aunt hosted a. I had been sitting 3 feet away from her newest rendition. Poor me. I tried to help, laughing when people laughed, nodding when they nodded, letting her feel safe in the illusion was defanged. Someone at the table, our great aunt, the one with the sharp memory, was telling an old story about the day my cousin was. She called it the blizzard baby night, insisting the snow had been so thick the car practically skated to the hospital, and my cousin, without thinking, corrected her. It wasn't snowing. It was summer. Her voice was quick and flat, almost scolding, and then she froze, realizing she'd stepped into a trap she didn't know existed. Our great aunt blinked, confused, and reminded her that the family still had the Polaroids of the snowdrifts. My cousin laughed it off and said she was mixing up holidays, but the laugh was brittle. I wrote a single word in my notebook. Summer? From that moment forward, the they had always been there. At a birthday dinner the fall, that was March, the same month. No, I was full term. Dad always bragged I arrived. Her father, seated at the other end of set his fork down. He just stared at his plate. The room shifted. It was subtle, a barely perceptible draft, but it moved through the air all the. I tucked that moment next. Going. Old arguments resurfaced in my mind with new meaning, flipping like flashcards I'd once failed but could suddenly answer. I remembered a fight we'd had in high school, after she had spoiled a chance I had for a leadership position by telling the faculty sponsor, too emotional for responsibility. When I confronted her, she came back with a line I'd never understood. At least I know where I come from. At the time, I'd assumed she meant her values, some moral high ground but now, replaying her look, tight jaw, eyes glittering with something too raw to be, I heard a different meaning. That same year, during a biology unit, she made a loud joke about couldn't pass a simple, and when I called her, she doubled down. I thought she was. Now, it felt like a dare thrown at. I dug deeper, letting small clues pile up until they grew heavy with him. There was the time, years ago, when a relative commented that my cousin had her daddy's blue. Hazel. She said it softly, automatic, like someone who practiced rewiring facts so many times. There was the Christmas when my grandmother mixed up a gift tag and handed my cousin one that held. Cousin snapped it open, laughed, and not me, and then glanced at my aunt, so she and I both knew. I remembered how my cousin, how she squeezed my shoulder. All these moments, once dismissed, became coordinates on the seed of suspicion had. What if her war with me? What if the fury that stalked, but about obsession to make me small, might have been the terror she couldn't admit? That there was a question buried under, a question about blood. I didn't want that. It felt cruel to imagine. Shame tried to. For her storms. What kind of person pokes around in someone else's origins? What kind of cousin follows rumors of blizzards and birth months as if they were clues to a crime? But then I remembered her face, triumphant under the community hall lights, and I let the shame pass through me like a cold wind. I had swallowed enough false guilt to last a lifetime. The injustice of her campaign, the public accusations, the targeted smears, the relentless rebranding of rose in me like if she was willing to stand in friendly and rip my character. Justice isn't. I wasn't digging. I was digging to stop. Anger still lived in me, but I had learned how to. I didn't let it slap. I sharpened it into observation. I noticed the way my aunt and how quickly my cousin, who tried to compare. I noticed how my cousin bristled when used to protect a friend. Demand that my cousin. Secrets of that size don't yield. I would lie awake, replaying every breadcrumb, and then wake with the dread of, if my suspicion was true, then my cousin's intent had been built on it, and knocking on it could lapse more than just her pride. It could break hearts that thought almost stopped me. But then I remembered her public thrill, the vocation she, and I understood that she had already broken some without blinking. The scale was already on. Suspense began to take over the help. It wasn't just if anymore, it was how. How had the story been changed? Who had changed? What were the stakes, and who else knew? Family gatherings became quiet. Every casual story. I sat in living rooms, watched cheeks tight, watched hands still. I asked questions with neutral voices, eyes soft, and I let the answers pour into the notebook in my tote. I started to feel like not looking for a villain, but for a version of the truth that could finally explain the strange violence of my cousin's obsession with my ruin. Then came the shock I couldn't unsee. It arrived in a shoebox, the kind all grandmothers keep, the archive of a life documented in paper and film. After dinner one night, while washing dishes shoulder to shoulder with my grandmother, I asked if I could sort through old photos for a project. She lit up the way elders do when the past has an audience and shuffled to the hall closet. We sat at the table, the photos fanned between us, and she told stories soft as honey. That's when I found it. A hospital Polaroid with the date stamped in corner, a nurse's arm visible, a bouquet of carnations on the bedside, and my aunt looking tired. The date wasn't winter. It wasn't even close. On the back, in my grandmother's tidy script, our summer surprise. I swallowed hard and kept flipping. Another glossy print showed a man, not my uncle, holding a pink bundle with a look of astonishment that didn't match any story I'd ever been told. He wore a visitor badge from a hospital 2 counties over, the logo peeking from. When I asked Grandma who he was, she squinted, smiled like at an old song, and, "Oh, that was an old friend of your aunt. He helped with the ride." Then she caught herself, cleared her throat, and what a mess that day. Tucking the photo back in as if hands. I should have left it, but truth, once it lifts, hates being shoved back into the dirt. I checked dates against family miles. I compared timelines with school year calendars. I remembered the time my cousin had a minor medical, and the urgent care doctor asked her a question about a family My aunt had answered quickly, saying no history, and my cousin had glared. Yes, Dad sighed, and there had been a long silence. One of those silences, but like a presence with its own. I thought about medical forms, blood types, and the jokey high school. I remembered my cousin's sudden distance, how she turned in a blank, hated blood. Even though seen individually, none of these moments would, but together they hummed like a wire. Vindication rose, not as gloating. I was finally seeing my cousin's rage toward me wasn't merely, it was about proximity. Threatened the story that secured her. If blood was the question. She couldn't solve by making me small. No wonder she had tried to erase me in public. When a lie feels endangered, it learns to bite. I imagined for the first time her shame, not the petty shame of being caught gossiping, but the existential shame of seeing a story unravel that you had stapled your identity. I almost pitied her. Almost. But pity didn't erase the harm she had done or the choice she had made to trade my dignity for her security. If there was going to be any triumph in this, it wouldn't be in watching her collapse. It would be in finally stepping out from under the shadow she had cast and reclaiming my name with something no stage could. Fact. There was only one way to get it. Gossip had walked me to the door. Photographs had placed my hand on the knob, and dates had turned it halfway. The only thing that could open it fully was science. Cold, unbending, indifferent to stories and the people who spin them. DNA does not negotiate. It doesn't take sides. It doesn't care who cried the loudest at a family party or who performed the most convincing monologue. It placed a simple choice in front of me. Remain inside the fog or step into clarity and accept whatever the light. I wrestled with it for 2 more nights, pacing my apartment like a defendant waiting for a verdict. I considered consequences and casualties. I listened to the voice that was meddling with some and the one that said sacred things do not. By the 3rd morning, this wasn't vengeance. It was necessary. If I was wrong, the test would protect her. Either way, the truth I had finally learned. I opened my laptop with a calm I hadn't felt it. Whatever my cousin thought it with whispers, I was about to challenge. From this moment on, families like to bury secrets. After ordering the DNA kit, I couldn't simply sit back. It's nearly impossible. Slip of the tongue. Suddenly it all felt. And if there's one thing I knew about, the more I thought about, the more I realized this wasn't just about me and it was about a legacy of secrecy into our family tree. So I went digging. It started innocently enough, with photo albums stacked in my grandmother's hall closet, their spines cracked and pages curling from years of fingerprints. I flipped through the glossy snapshots, searching for consistencies and inconsistencies the way detectives examine fingerprints. At first, it felt like nostalgia. Pictures of birthdays, backyard barbecues, Christmas mornings with torn wrapping paper littering the floor. But the deeper I went, the stranger it became. Some albums were meticulously labeled with names and dates, while others were conspicuously vague. A whole year would sometimes be skipped, or a name would be replaced with something generic like friend. And in those gaps, my suspicion grew. One photograph in particular caught me off guard. It was a faded Polaroid of my aunt, standing in a hospital bed, cradling a newborn. The date written in ballpoint pen didn't match the season she'd always claimed my cousin was born in. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable. She had always been diligent about recording details, but the discrepancy gnawed at me. Why would the story of a birth be told so differently depending on who was talking? What reason could there be for twisting something so fundamental? Shame tried to creep in as I sifted through those, whispering that I was violating some sacred boundary, poking my nose into business that wasn't mine. But then I remembered the humiliation, and I reminded I wasn't the one who had. If my cousin could strip me bare in front of everyone, then I had a right to peel old documents tucked away in box, a birth certificate exchanged between us where the tone was writing something unspoken. There were references, and one note even. My hands trembled. This wasn't just a deliberate rewrite. Anger surged as I considered how long this deception allowed to live. If my suspicions were correct, my cousin had built her entire identity on, and yet she had the audacity to accuse me, to drag my name through, to stand in front of our family. It wasn't just it was unbearable. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to shove the Polaroids and but anger alone wouldn't win me. I already learned that still, none of it was old photo. Vague letters, half-whispered family stories. They all pointed to something being wrong, but they didn't prove anything. They raised questions without providing answers. I could confront my family with what I had, but they'd dismiss it as speculation, as paranoia, as me trying to retaliate against my cousin. I was gathering kindling, but without a spark, it wouldn't ignite, and that realization left me restless, pacing my room late at night, wondering if I was. But suspense kept me moving. Every new inconsistent, I began listening more, tuning in to the offhand's older relative. I overheard one uncle mutter, and another mention the things we don't talk about. At first, these sounded like throwaway remarks, but stacked against, they felt like bread. The shock came one afternoon when I stumbled across. Most were mundane, holiday greetings, invitation, thank you note. But one was different. It was addressed to my aunt, dated 9 months before, and it was from a man whose. The letter was affectionate, even intimate, and it mentioned with a mix of fear and my chest tightened as I. This wasn't just gossip, or this was tangible evidence that the family tie had fractures. Vindication. For the first time, I was certain. My cousin's obsession with this, she wasn't just jealous, she was terrified that every rumor she spread, every public humor was all smoke meant, and I couldn't help but imagine the cousin who had paraded herself, who had built her identity, would be unmasked in front. That vision fueled, not the shallow triumph of knowing I had endured. And it was only a matter of time before it broke free from the chains of secrecy that had bound it for decades. That night, with trembling hands, I went online and ordered a DNA kit. My heart pounded as I clicked confirm, because I knew this wasn't just about science, it was about justice. The truth was finally within reach, and soon, no amount of lies could keep it buried. To catch her truth, I had to risk becoming a liar myself. Ordering the DNA kit had been the easy part. Clicking confirm purchase only required one flick of my finger, one moment of courage. But what came next demanded something far riskier, stepping into her world of deception, just long enough to gather what I needed. For months I had promised myself I would never become like her, that I would never twist or manipulate to win. But there comes a point when you realize the truth doesn't always walk politely to you. Sometimes it has to be stolen, and that meant crossing a line I had sworn I wouldn't. The box arrived discreetly in a plain envelope, tucked between junk mail and a coupon flyer. My heart raced as hands trembled, as though simply possessing it. I tore it open, studied the still, even Monday. But there was nothing. If I was right, if I was wrong, shame was my. As I read the instructions, I heard my mother's reminding me about choosing honest. What kind of person sneaks behind family? What kind of woman risks exposing private truth? The thought made I wasn't proud of, but then I remembered the way she had. I wasn't doing this. Still, why did I have to go? It wasn't fair. But then again, thinking about her betrayal, justice wasn't going to. I had to fight for it, even if the fight meant dirtying my. So I began planning. I knew the DNA sample. It couldn't be mine alone. A hairbrush. It sounded simple in simple. Every opportunity carried risk. The first chance came at a family dinner. The room smelled of roast chicken and buttered rolls, the sound of conversation rising and falling like background music. My cousin sat across from me, sipping soda from a clear glass, the condensation sliding down its sides. My eyes kept darting to it, my pulse drumming in my ears. When she set it down and excused herself to the restroom, I felt my body move before my brain caught up. I reached for the glass, wrapping it quickly in a napkin, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could. But just as I began to slide it toward my lap, her voice rang out. She was coming back. Panic flooded me. I shoved the glass back into it, trying to steady. She sat down, glanced at me. Did she know? Or was it paranoia twisting her smile into... Either way, I knew that attempt. Anger crackled and I hated how much power, even in her absence. I hated that I had become a sneaking glances at glasses and yet, the truth was worth the risk. My next attempt came a week later. She had invited a few relatives over for coffee, and I went along, feigning normal. As the evening wound down, I noticed her hairbrush sitting on the strands of hair. My hands shook as I closed the door, pulling the brush toward my purse. But just as I slipped it inside a plastic bag I had hidden in my coat, I heard footsteps and the doorknob jiggle. You almost done in there? Her voice called, casual, curious, but laced with that undertone I had. My pulse raced as I quickly set the brush back exactly where, tucking the bag deep, almost, forcing my voice steady. She didn't press, but when I opened the door, she was standing there, arms folded, studying me with eyes She said nothing, but her silence, helplessness wrapped around me again as I lay awake What if she suspected me already? What if I was in over my head? What if the truth wasn't worth the risk? But even as doubt gnawed at me, suspense pulled me forward. I couldn't stop now. I was too close. Finally, the chance came unexpectedly at another family gathering. She had been drinking water from a bottle, leaving it on the table and at the door. My pulse quickened as I sliding it into my bag with one smooth, no interruptions, no close call, just quiet triumph as the plastic. I excused myself shortly after, muttering something, and walked to my car with the bottle pressed like treasure. Shock coursed through me when I sealed the sample inside the kit, labeling it carefully, my fingers trembling as though I held the fuse to an explosive. I couldn't believe what I had done. Me, the cousin she had always painted as the naive one, the soft one, the weak one. I had stolen her DNA, and as guilty as it made me feel, I couldn't deny the rush of vindication. For once I had outplayed her. Mailing it off felt like sending a piece of myself away. I stood in line at the post office, the envelope tucked beneath my arm. When it was finally my turn, I slid it across the counter, and the clerk barely glanced at it before tossing it into a... Just like that, months of fear and suspicion were out of my hands. Now all I could do was wait. Those days of waiting were torture. Every morning I checked my email before my feet even touched the floor. Every evening I refreshed the page again, as if sheer willpower could make the result. The suspense was unbearable, a constant pressure in my... I rehearsed every possible outcome in... What if I was wrong? What if the DNA proved worse? What would it mean for my... Then came the mini twist. The results arrived sooner than expected. I had braced myself for weeks, but only days after... I hadn't even been... No dramatic buildup, no warning, just a single notification. My stomach dropped, my hands... Vindication felt close, because once I opened that email, and the truth, what I imagined her shame, what it would look like if the DNA, the cousin who had built her identity, what would she do? And in that vision, not the triumph, but the triumph, no smirk, no manipulation, the email notification, the glow casting, my breath caught. I knew that once I clicked, I just didn't know how. What I saw on that screen turned my humiliation into her doom. The moment had come, the one I had both craved and feared. My phone screen glowed in the dark kitchen, the notification sitting there like a loaded weapon. The subject line from the DNA company was innocuous, almost clinical. Your results are ready. But I knew better. Those 4 words carried the weight of decades of lies, whispered scandals, and the very war my cousin had waged against me. For days I had imagined this moment, but imagining was safe. Clicking was not. Clicking meant the truth would no longer be a possibility. It would be real, permanent, undeniable. My finger hovered, trembling. Shame hit me first, the echo of my mother's voice reminding me that snooping into someone else's origins wasn't noble. What if I had crossed a line I could never uncross? What if the truth I unearthed didn't just destroy her, but also shattered people I... That weight pressed on my... For a moment, I nearly put the phone down, nearly chose ignorance. But then I remembered standing in that community hall, the laughter ringing in my ears, my cousin's smirk gleaming in victory. I remembered the whispers, the shame she had, and in that memory, I hadn't crossed the line. She had, long before. I was simply pulling back a deep breath. The page loaded slow, each second stretching in, my palms slick, and then, in stark black, the results were clear, undeniable, scientific. She wasn't who she... The DNA showed without question that her father, my uncle, was not her biological. The test didn't just whisper suspicion, it screamed confirmation. The bloodlines we had been raised to believe tied us together, at least not in the way my cousin, the who had tormented me, humiliated, and built her suit on our shared family cousin at all. She had spent her life building a kingdom on quick injustice, had accused me of betraying the people, yet all along her had been built on a... It wasn't even... She hadn't chosen how she was, who her real father was, or why our aunt had She had been raised inside a story that wasn't true, but instead of protecting herself, she had projected her shame, scapegoating. She had destroyed me to keep... Anger surged, fierce and consuming, not at the results themselves, but at the way she had handled them. She must have known, at least on some level. Her rage toward me, her obsession with humiliating me, it suddenly made sense. I was the mirror she couldn't bear to look into, and instead of facing her reflection, she had smashed mine. My hands trembled as I thought about every lie she had, every rumor she had said, every moment she had stood tall while I was forced to shrink. She had known, and she had still chosen cruelty. But even as anger burned, helplessness crept. What was I supposed to do with this information? DNA doesn't come with a manual for... Should I confront her? Should I tell the family? Should I stay silent and let her continue her reign of lies? Every option carried risk. Exposing her could devastate people I loved. My aunt, my uncle, even my grandmother. The truth could tear apart generations of but staying silent meant letting her win again, letting her narrative stand. The weight of that decision, leaving me... The phone screen suspense became... I couldn't unsee but I wasn't ready to act on. Every time I saw her face, every time she smirked or I thought about the secret humming beneath. She wasn't untouchable. She wasn't the queen of the narrative. She was a liar, and I held the proof. That knowledge gave me a strange power, one I wasn't sure how to use, but one I knew would change everything. The shock of it all hit me. This wasn't just about my humiliation. It was about the entire... My aunt had carried a secret, one she had hidden from her. My cousin had weaponized out, ever fully, and I, the one, was now the keeper. The family tree had always been tangled. Vindication for the first time in years. She was. She had accused me of living a false life while her entire identity had been. The irony was almost poetic. She had turned the family against me too. But in the end, her secret was the very. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the villain. I was the one who had endured, who had searched, who had fought quietly for. And in that vindication, when the DNA. The thought of her pale face, her trembling lips, her desperate denial, it should have satisfied me. But strangely, it didn't. What satisfied me was knowing that I no longer needed her approval, her validation, or her acknowledgement. The truth itself was enough. Still, triumph lingered, waiting. Because I knew the truth wasn't meant to stay locked in my phone. It wasn't just mine to carry. This secret belonged to the entire family, and whether they liked it or not, they deserved to know. My cousin had chosen to humiliate me, to weaponize lies against me, and now it was time for her to experience what it felt like when, as I stared at the results one last time, my resolve hardened. The family deserved the truth, no matter how devastating. My cousin had buried me, but this time I would bury her, and soon revenge is sweetest when pain. After staring at the DNA results until the text blurred into streaks across, I finally closed the lap. The truth was mine. The temptation to expose her was nearly. I pictured storming into her, waving the results in her, watching her smirk. If I struck too soon, she always did. I needed precision, staged so carefully when shame still flickered, a whisper asking, reminding myself I was carrying the truth. Still, this wasn't just my grandmother who had kept records so meticulous. My mother, exposing the truth for days but each time, the injustice of lateral damage. She had never thought twice. Left on me. My hesitation wasn't nobility, it was conditioning. For years she had trained me to take the blame, to feel guilty even when I was the victim. Not anymore. This time, justice demanded a voice. Anger fueled my resolve. It wasn't the wild, uncontrolled anger I had once felt, the kind that burned me from the inside out. No, this was quieter, sharper, honed like a blade. I was done swallowing her poison. I was done being silenced by her performance. The anger now gave me clarity. This wasn't just about me reclaiming my dignity. It was about cutting through years of deceit, about making sure she could never again stand in front of a crowd and smear me without consequence. If she wanted a stage, I would give her one. But this time, the script wouldn't be hers. Still, helplessness visited me in the late hours of the night. What if they didn't believe me? What if I stood in front of the family, DNA results in hand, and they still sided with her? She was the actress after all. She knew how to cry on cue, how to clutch her chest and say, "How could you believe her over me?" The thought of being dismissed again, of being painted as cruel or vindictive, nearly paralyzed me. I imagined the gasps, the accusations turning back on me. Why would you do this? Why would you tear us apart? That possibility haunted me so deeply that I almost tore the results into shreds just to rid myself of the responsibility. But every time I reached that breaking point, I remembered her smirk, and I knew I couldn't let fear silence me again. Suspense became my constant companion. I carried the truth like a hidden flame, burning hot in my pocket wherever I went. Every family gathering became electric. Would this be the moment I revealed? Would today be the day the mask? I rehearsed the reveal in mind, over and over, imagining different angles of attack. Some days I pictured presenting the fact. Other days I imagined letting the words cut which version of me. But I knew the time. Shock came, and my cousin had always been sharp, and it didn't take long for her to sense a shift. Maybe it was the way I stopped, the way I no longer, or the calm smile. One evening, at a casual family dinner, "You've been quiet." Her tone was playful, but her eyes were too. My heart pounded, but I met her gaze. She smirked, but there was a flicker of unease, a tiny crack. She didn't know what I had, and that made her. Vindication pulsed through me. For years I had been the one walking on eggshells, waiting for her next attack. Now she was the one scanning my face for clues, sensing the storm gathering but unable to stop it. For once, the balance of power had shifted. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. I simply needed to wait. The truth was patient. The truth was permanent. And soon, the truth would be public. I imagined her shame, looming like a shadow just ahead. The same family who once gasped at her accusations against me would gasp again, this time at her exposure. The same relatives who applauded her boldness would watch her crumble, her superiority disintegrating. And this time, there would be no stagecraft, no smirk to shield her, no lie strong enough to withstand of DNA. And finally, triumph glimmered on the horizon. It wasn't here yet. I still had to face the battlefield. But the thought of standing in that room, presenting the results with, this wasn't about vengeance, and it was about closure, about balance, about finally reclaiming my voice in the very space. When the invitation for the family reunion arrived, the biggest gathering of the year where no one could hide, I knew my moment had the stage she once used. She had no idea she was walking into her own. The day of the family, right and deceptive, the kind of morning that makes you think nothing, but I knew better, turning it over in my hidden but showing for the right moment. And now, as I stood in front of them, was held at a spot in shelters. On the surface, it was voice dripping. She didn't know what. As the family was gathering for announcements, everyone clustered under the shelter, plates of food in their hands, the air buzzing with chatter. My cousin cleared her throat, tapped her glass with a fork, and raised her voice above the crowd. Before we dive into dessert, she said sweetly, I just want to take a moment to say how much I love this family. We're all so close, so honest with each other, except, of course, when some of us think secrets are better than truth. Her eyes slid to me, the smirk curling on her lips. But that's nothing new. The crowd chuckled nervously, shifting their attention toward me, just as she intended. It was her old game, her old performance, and once upon a time it would have worked. Shame pricked at me for a fleeting second, the familiar heat rising in my cheeks as dozens of eyes pinned me in place. But this time shame didn't linger, because this time I wasn't defenseless. I stood slowly, setting my plate aside, and the chatter died instantly. All eyes stayed on me as I smoothed the edge of my blouse and let my voice cut through the... You're right, I said evenly. This family deserves honesty, which is why today is the perfect day to finally tell the truth. Her smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough. Injustice, all the years of it, weighed heavy in my voice as I began. For years I've stood here while you've accused me, mocked me, humiliated me. You've painted me as a liar, as someone untrustworthy, as if I had something to hide. But the truth is, the only person hiding anything here is you. Gasps rippled through the crowd, heads swiveling between us. My cousin's smile stiffened, but her eyes narrowed like daggers. Anger surged in me, not wild, but steady, controlled. You've accused me of lies, yet your entire life has been built on one. You've spread rumors, but science doesn't bend to gossip. You've smirked at my pain, but today the smirk is yours to carry. With deliberate slowness, I pulled out the folded papers from my bag. My hands didn't shake. For once I was calm. Helplessness had haunted me for so long that this moment felt surreal, like breaking through the surface after being held underwater. For years I had been silenced by her but now, as I unfolded the papers and let the logo of the DNA company gleam in the sunlight, the silence was hers to bear. The suspense hung heavy as I began to read. This is a DNA report. It proves without question that the man we've all called my uncle is not your biologist. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, muffled cries. Voices tumbled over one another in dismay. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads, and a few simply stared, stunned into silence. The weight of the revelation shaking the ground. For the first time, expression betrayed her. The practiced innocence, the smirk, the faux concern, all of it shattered. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But there was none. Shock rippled through the family like a tidal wave. My aunt's fork clattered to the table, her face pale as she clutched the edge of her chair. My uncle's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against his plate. Cousins whispered frantically, while older relatives shook their heads as though the very foundation of our family had been ripped away. Vindication surged in me, electric and undeniable. For years, she had made me the villain in every story. But now, in front of everyone, the truth stood bare. She wasn't the noble cousin protecting the family. She was the liar, the fraud, the one who had built her power on deception. I no longer had to defend myself. The DNA spoke for me, louder than her rumors ever could, and in that moment I saw the first crack. Her cheeks flushed, her breathing quickened. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. For once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The stage she had owned for so long, the spotlight, triumph glimmered at the end. Not because I had destroyed her, but because the truth was finally, for the first time in years, unbroken, and all eyes turned. The accusations were no longer mine. The family wanted answers from her, and in that silence, heavy as a guillotine, I watched her face the executioners. Cornered animals bite hardest, and she was no exception. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. Dozens of eyes pinned my cousin in place, waiting, demanding, silently insisting on answers she could no longer hide from. I had dropped the truth like a stone into still water, and the ripples had already spread through every heart at that reunion. But while I stood steady, anchored by the DNA results in my hand, she was unraveling before our eyes. At first she laughed, a high-pitched, brittle sound that rang false even to the children. "This is ridiculous," her voice shook. "She's making this up. She's jealous as always. She'll do anything to drag me down." Her words were sharp, but they were too rushed, too desperate. The very tone betrayed her. For years she had mastered control, playing the role of the calm accuser while I was. Now the roles had reversed, and she didn't know how to wear the mask. Shame spread across her feet. She tried to stand tall, but her shoulders curved. She tried to smirk, but her lips quivered. Her voice grew louder as if volume could replace. "These papers don't mean anything," she shouted, jabbing her finger toward me. "She probably faked them. She's always been manipulative. Don't fall for this." But the injustice of her words didn't land this time. The family, who had once nodded and gasped at her accusations against me, now sat frozen, their expressions twisted, not in agreement. They had seen the papers. They had seen my composure and her hysteria. Slowly, they were beginning to recognize what I had always known. She was the liar, not me. Anger boiled in her, and she hurled words like, "You've always hated me. You've always been jealous of me, of my friends, of my looks, of my life. This is your pathetic attempt to destroy me because you can't stand that people." Her voice cracked, tears springing to her. But they weren't the tears of grief. They were the crocodile tears of someone used to weaponize, and this time no one was buying it. For a moment, helplessness flickered through me. Watching her unravel was almost painful. Almost. Because while I had spent years begging to be, she had spent years hiding behind, and now she was collapsing under the weight of her. It wasn't me pushing her. It was the truth, finally free, pressing down on her shoulders until she buckled. The suspense in the air was. Family members exchanged glances, whispers rose, and all eyes remained fixed. My uncle's face was pale, his jaw clenched, my aunt's hand suddenly made sense. The silence wasn't on my side anymore. It was on hers, and it was suffocating her. Then came the shock of her desperation. She lunged forward, pointing at me with venom in her voice. "She's lying. She's lying, and you're all fools for believing her. Don't you see what she's doing? She wants to tear this family apart because she's miserable." Her voice cracked again, and the tears spilled down her cheeks. But her performance was faltering. She was too frantic, too panicked. The cracks in her armor weren't just visible, they were gaping. Vindication surged through me as I watched her allies peel away one by one. An older cousin who had once defended her shook his head slowly, muttering, "I should have known." An aunt who had often laughed at her jabs against me now frowned, arms folded, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Even her closest friend in the family stepped back, her hand dropping from my cousin's shoulder as if suddenly scorched. The fortress she had built so carefully was collapsing in real time, brick by brick, under the weight of undeniable truth. And then, the shame that had once belonged to me finally wrapped itself around. She stumbled, her words faltering, her gaze darting wildly for someone, anyone, to come to her rescue. But there was no rescue this time. The stage she had once commanded was hostile now. The spotlight too hot, the audience too cold. She had mocked me for my silence in the past, but now it was her silence that would. Triumph lingered at the edges, not as a smile. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me, exposing her without my help. For the first time in my life, I realized revenge didn't require. It only required patience. But then it happened. The cliffhanger I never saw come. In her desperation, her voice cracked into a scream. "Fine. You want the truth? You want the damn truth?" Her chest heaved, her face flushed, and the tears streaming down her cheeks no longer looked real. "Yes, he's not my father. He never was. Is that what you want?" The crowd gasped in a sound so sharp it seemed. My aunt buried her face. She had admitted it, and now it was how they would serve. Sometimes the truth. "Yes, he's not my father. He never was." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Every family member frozen in disbelief. Children stopped running, forks clattered against plates, and for a moment the world itself seemed to tilt sideways. The lie she had lived by, the foundation she had used to destroy me, was gone. And with it, the illusion that had held our family together. But the truth doesn't stop at one person. It ripples outward, colliding with everything in its path, tearing apart anything fragile enough to shatter. And as the gas gave way to questions, as my aunt buried her face in her hands and my uncle stood rigid in pain, it became clear that this confession wasn't. This was a fracture running, a wound the family. His voice low, but is it true? She shook her head, tears streaking. Please, not here. But her words only fanned. Not here? He snapped. You let me raise a child for years under a lie, and now you want to choose the time and place. His hands trembled, but his anger was steady, searing. Shame gripped the crowd, each of us realizing we had lived beside a secret so large it had shaped our family's history without us ever knowing. My grandmother clutched her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. An uncle muttered, shaking his head as if finally connecting the dots he had. A cousin murmured about the time, the contradictions, and the puzzle piece scattered across decades, and the picture they formed was devastating. Injustice roared inside. For years I had been the one accused of deception, of betrayal. Yet here it was, proof that the betrayal had... My cousin's cruelty hadn't come from nowhere. It had been born from the shame of being a lie my aunt had, a lie my uncle, and I had been the scapegoat, the one sacrifice. They had let me bleed so they'd stay hidden. Anger seared my veins, not just at her entire web of... My aunt wept, begging for forgiveness, insisting she had done it to protect the family. The words made bile rise in... Protecting the family had meant destroying me, allowing lies to fester, letting my cousin sharpen her shame into knives and drive them into... It wasn't protection, it was cowardice. And now, the cowardice had finally erupted into... But even in my anger, helplessness, I had uncovered the truth, yes, but the truth was bigger than me now. It wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about dismantling the illusion that had bound us all together. I watched my uncle's face crumble as decades of love and trust collapsed into dust. I saw cousins whispering furiously, old grievances resurfacing with new fuel. My grandmother sobbed quietly, murmuring about sins coming, and in that storm of devastation I realized that no matter how much I had prepared for this moment, I wasn't prepared. Wounds would go. Suspense thickened with it. I didn't ask to be. Her words cracked, sharp, and questions poured out. Who was her real? How long had my... The storm raged loud, apart the thin fabric. The shock came in, but I hadn't anticipated lateral damage. My cousin wasn't just guilty of... She was also a victim of her mother's choices. My aunt wasn't just a deceiver. She was a woman who had carried a burden too heavy, making choices that had poisoned generations. And my uncle, my poor uncle, wasn't just stripped of his identity. The lie had cut through all of them, not just her. Vindication still lived inside me, fierce and I had endured humiliation, whispers, and false accusations, but now the truth was laid bare for all. I wasn't the liar, I wasn't the manipulator, I wasn't the I was the one who had sought truth. For years she had thrived on my... But now the roles were her shame was undeniable, written into the very science. Her shame filled the air, thick and soft. The cousin who had once basked in shoulders hunched, mascara streaking. Her allies were gone. Her power was gone. She was naked under the spotlight she had once controlled. The mask ripped away, the crowd seeing, and in that moment, triumph hovered within. Not the triumph of cruelty, not the shallow thrill of but the triumph of justice, of balance. I had carried her lies but now those chains... The truth was free, and so was I. The family argued, voices rising, wounds spilling open like rivers, but I stood calm. Slowly I stepped forward, clutching the DNA result. Enough. You've all heard her. You've all seen the truth. Now, let me speak my final word. And as the crowd hushed, turning toward me, I felt the storm's eyes settle on my shoulders. It was my moment to claim justice at last. When the dust settled, I wasn't just vindicated. I was reborn. The echoes of my cousin's confession still hung in the air long after the family reunion had ended. People drifted home in stunned silence, conversations cut short, hugs replaced with stiff nods, and the laughter that once defined our gathering swallowed by tension. I stood there, the paper still clutched in my hand, realizing the world I had known, the one where my cousin ruled with lies, was gone forever, and with its end came something I had never truly believed: freedom. For years I had carried shame that I had worn it like an anchor, but after that it shifted where onto her shoulder. My grandmother, once to keep, burdened by the knowledge, injustice, because if they had spoken sooner, if they had come, maybe I wouldn't have been the target of my cousin's. Anger followed, not fiery and anger at the choices that the years of but anger gave way to something soft because while my choices had I had chosen to fight, not with louder accusation, with strategy, and in that choice I discovered a strength still Helplessness had its moments even after the unwilling to choose. Peace was worth more than truth. Those words stung, but they didn't wound. Because for the first time, I understood that peace without truth isn't peace at all. It's just silence wearing a mask. And I had lived long enough under masks. Suspense lingered in the weeks after the reveal, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I wondered what new form her desperation might. Would she lash out again? Would she find some way to twist even this, to turn pity into power? But the suspense fizzled when I realized she no longer had an audience. Her stage was gone. Her allies had left her. Her smirk had vanished. She was no longer the actress. She was the cautionary tale. The shock that remained was not hers anymore. It was mine. Because as I sat with the truth, I realized just how deep the lies had. This wasn't just about one cousin's cruelty or one aunt's affair. It was about a family culture of silence, of hiding wounds instead of burying truths until that realization. Not because it weakened, because it made me vow that my life would not be vindication. Every time I walked into a room and felt eyes shift toward, I no longer shrank. Every time someone whispered, I no longer assumed. I knew the whispers were. Every time I remembered that night, the humiliation she had buried me in, and her shame, she no longer strutted into family events with. She no longer smirked when she arrived late, if at all, sitting quietly in the corner, avoiding questions, avoiding me. Her empire of lies had crumbled. And for years she had. Now she was the one diminished, and there was no satisfaction in her stripped of the power, the kind that comes when you no longer have to do. I no longer needed, because my victory was already written in the resilience in the strength I had, in the truth that had carried me. As I look back now, I circle to where the night in that. Back then I thought that but today I see it. That night wasn't my end, it was my beginning. Because humiliation turned into injustice turned into anger turned into strength. She once thought my silence was weakness, but in the Osasia end, it was my silence, my patience, my strategy that became her undoing. When the dust settled, I wasn't just vindicated, I was reborn. And this time, the laughter that echoes in my ears isn't hers, it's mine. So that was my story. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent or exposed the truth like I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because I've got more stories you won't want to miss. Let's keep this conversation going.